Hi, everyone. Today I'm covering for Dr. Zinn. She's recovering from an accident that she had. She put up some videos that she did from home, and she should be back with her class by next week. I want you to know that we're going to postpone your midterm for this class for one additional week because I know that there's a lot of material that you're getting at one time. She posted lesson 3 and 4, and today I'm doing lesson 5. All right. So instead of having the review this week, you will have the review a week later. All right. On week 7. And then you'll have your midterm on week 8. And I'm sure she'll talk to you about it as well. But I didn't want you to have too much information given to you at one time, because there's a lot of things to talk about in a sociology class. And I wanted you to be able to listen to it at a comfortable pace for you. Today, my lecture is going to be on racial persecution. This is a very serious thing, and it is discrimination against a person based on their race, their color of their skin, or their ethnicity, right? We're seeing a lot of racial persecution in the world today, but it has existed for many, many years, for as long as people have been around, all right? We see things like the Black Lives Matter protests. We see things about Asians being targeted because people believe that the Asians were the ones, all Asians, were the ones that brought COVID over. And of course, we know that's not the case, but there are people who are ignorant and they are hurting people about that. There's all kinds of persecution. There's persecution in the workplace for African Americans, for women, right? Women don't make what men make. And also Hispanics. We see a lot of persecution right now down on the southern border of the United States, where people are trying to cross from Mexico, Venezuela, and different countries where there's turmoil or war or something that's upsetting the economy or the politics, trying to get to the United States and to safety, all right? So how can people be discriminated against? Number one, people could refuse to do business with them. So if they don't do business with the certain company or certain small store, the people don't make money and they lose their business, and then they have a hard time surviving. People can persecute others by not socializing with people, not talking with them, not including them in planning, not including them with groups, and also sharing resources with other people, okay? If you need certain things to build your car and we want to discriminate against you, we may not be a supplier to you, all right? Now, racial persecution has been extensive for as long as the United States has been in existence. In the colonial era, remember that the Pilgrims came over from England because they were persecuted. They were told that they could not celebrate their religion. So they came over and they landed here so that they could have religious freedom. So they wanted to escape persecution. But the weird thing was, they in turn began to persecute the Native Americans. They were massacred, they were forced to leave their land, and they still face continued discrimination. So what I want you to think about also is that after the Native Americans, when we see a big movement, we see a big movement about African Americans. African Americans were brought, even during colonial times, but later as well, to the United States to work as slaves. Slavery removes a person's rights, okay? So persecution removes some of removes your rights. They were forced to live in terrible conditions, to work very, very hard for very little. They were beaten, they were sold, their families were separated. So that's another example of persecution in the United States. We also see persecution against Hispanics, Middle Eastern people, and Asian Americans. Jews, Poles, Italians, and Irish were also terribly discriminated against when they immigrated to the United States. There would be signs that would say, "No Irish need apply for a job," or terrible fights would break out and people would call each other names, and it was really terrible. So what ways do people use to discriminate against one group or another? Well, there's one called genocide, and that is the killing of a group of people with the hope of exterminating and eliminating that group of people. And we've seen this in other countries, okay? We've seen it during World War II, when Hitler decides he does not think that Jews should live, that they are inferior, and he wants to kill them all. In Armenia, there has been much fighting and genocide that took place. In the United States, one of the things that happened here was genocide against Native Americans. People believed that Native Americans were less than human. They were not civilized. They were savages. And therefore, so that the white colonists could live in peace, they believed that if they exterminated them, got rid of them, everything would be okay. All right. The next thing that we have is slavery. We just touched on that. So that's one way to get a group of people held hostage with no rights. So they can't vote, they can't change anything, they have no say in anything. Segregation is another way to discriminate against people. In the United States, when schools first opened, and later on into the 50s and even early 60s, segregation took place. It took place both in the North and the South, but to different degrees. In the South, there was more segregation. You had schools that Black children could go to and schools that white children went to. They had water fountains and bathrooms that separated people. When you took the bus, Black people had to sit in the back of the bus while white people could sit in the front. And there was a very famous case about that, where a woman named Rosa Parks sat on the bus in the white section. And she refused to get up when someone wanted her seat. She was arrested and brought to jail. But this started a new awakening in the civil rights movement at that time. And we'll talk about some of that in later in the class. So the Nationalization Act of 1790 set rules for gaining citizenship. It was limited only to free white men and women, okay? Free white men and women. So anyone who didn't fall into that group could not become a citizen. It didn't include Native Americans, slaves, free Blacks after the Civil War, indentured servants, people who had to work for others for a period of years to get their freedom for little or no food or money, okay? And then it included Asians as well. So this act prohibited everyone but white people to have citizenship. So if you don't have citizenship, what happens? You can't hold a national office, like you can't be a president or vice president or any national office. You can't vote in an election, so you have no voice, all right? So what you think and what you feel is not expressed in your government. You cannot get government assistance, meaning something like food stamps, or help with paying for college, or housing money if you can't afford your rent, right? And you also cannot serve on a jury. And serving on a jury in a court is a way that people can serve their country and serve their fellow citizens by listening to a case. And they say it's a jury of your peers, meaning your equals. So that blocks out a large number of people. The 14th Amendment in the US Constitution gave US-born African American citizenship through birthright, meaning that if they were born in the United States, they could become citizens. If they were not, they could not, okay? And Native Americans gained citizenship through the Indian citizenship of 1924. Can you imagine they were the first Americans and they had to wait till 1924 to become a citizen of the country that they lived in? That's not that long ago. It's like 100 years ago. And in history, that's a short time. In 1940, Chinese, Filipino persons, and races from India became eligible to become citizens. In 1940, less than 100 years ago, okay? So again, we're starting to get into more contemporary times. It took a while for people to recognize other people as citizens because they were being discriminated against through racial prejudice because of their race, okay, the color of their skin, or their place of origin. Southerners were now unable to, at that point, when they got the right to vote, keep down the Black votes and the words of African Americans. But they figured out another way to persecute African Americans. They instituted a poll tax, P-O-L-L. And this is a tax, a fee that is charged to certain people to vote in a national election. So I'm not saying they're asking for $1,000, but what if you have to pay $10 or $20 and you're poor? And a lot of people who they were targeting were poor. So if you can't pay the poll tax, you can't vote. So even though African Americans had the right to vote in the South, they were trying to stop that, okay, through racial prejudice by applying poll taxes. They also would have literacy tests. Can the people read and write? Well, many of these people could not read or write. They didn't check if other people could read or write, only African Americans. So they were persecuting them, keeping the voting down. We hear a lot about voting laws now, after the election when President Biden was elected. Many places are trying to stop mail-in ballots for people. Many places are trying to stop drop-off spots for ballots, or making things harder when people are standing on long lines to vote in the hot or in the cold. And now you're not allowed to give out bottles of water or food to these people. Well, why is this happening? It's happening because they want to stop the masses of people who turned out at the last election. So this is going on and on. New voting boundaries are being set up. You have to remember, if you're an older person and you have no car and you live in a rural area, if you move the polling place 40 miles away or 25 miles away, you're not going to be able to vote, are you? Because you don't have a car, you can't walk there. They don't have Uber in these rural farm areas. So they knock those people out too. So voting and persecution towards different groups still goes on today. And if you listen to the news, you'll hear about that. Another way to stop people and to persecute them and stop them from moving forward is through intimidation. Intimidation is threatening or doing bodily harm to people and showing others what will happen if you protest. Let's look at the world today. What's happened in Russia? In Russia, if you dare protest against what's happening in the Ukraine, the police immediately come, arrest you, throw you into a police van with many other people, and take you off to jail. The police say that people can't protest. It's just not legal in Russia. They also intimidate people by saying, if you do protest, you will be arrested. You may be convicted and have to spend time in jail. Or if you pay a fine and you're released, this arrest will stay on your record forever and it will hurt you. You may not be able to get certain jobs. Intimidation, stopping people to protest or to say things that they want. In the South, African Americans, Jews, were very much intimidated by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And they were an organization that dressed up in white robes, and they burned things and they intimidated people and they hung African Americans to enforce white supremacy, okay, white superiority. The civil rights movement resulted in enforcing every citizen's right to vote and to run for office. But again, you know, there are ways that you can get around those things, just like they did with the poll tax. Racial discrimination appears towards people in housing. For instance, for a long time, people were not shown houses in white areas if they were not white. They were shown areas with houses and housing in areas that were more racially mixed. Okay, so what happens with that? Well, first of all, it limits the places you can live, but remember that schooling is very important. And when you buy your home, it isn't, you try, if you have children, to get good school district. And if you're not being shown houses in the areas where there are good school district, your children will suffer as far as their education, because property taxes are what pays for schools. If you're in a more affluent or rich community, there's more tax generated. Therefore, better school, better teachers, smaller class size, more materials. If you're in a poorer area, unfortunately, the tax base is smaller. So that's how your racial prejudice takes place, in that you're sending your children to schools that get less money from the government, okay? And also, as far as racial profiling and prejudice with schools, curriculum played a big part of that in history. Recently, it would be, as I explained, you might not have laptops, they may have fewer computers, they might have lower paid teachers who maybe don't stay as long because they're looking for more money. But in the, I'd say, early 20th century, late 19th century, curriculum was actually written to belittle or to look down on certain races of people. And they were, the writings told that Native Americans were inferior. It told that African Americans were inferior. So that took quite some time to change. So again, we're looking at persecution, okay? And through this persecution, It's done through housing, it's done through schooling, it's done through lack of citizenship, or if you have citizenship, obstacles in the way to vote, okay? So, and also jobs. Many times, if you look at records, some people have to apply to more jobs to be considered than others because of their race, okay? In 1940, Chinese and Filipino persons and races, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Okay. Racial discrimination in housing, in schools, and even in the courts. We see it in the courts that they just changed the law about bail for certain things. Now, I'm not saying I'm for this law or against this law. I'm only explaining it. Bail reform came when they said that rich people or middle-class people could afford bail for sometimes very minor crimes. But many of the minorities, the Hispanics, the African Americans, they didn't have that money for the bail, and they would have to sit in jail awaiting trial. And the reason why they worked on bail reform was to give them an equal chance. As I said, I am not saying that it's right or wrong. It's just my job to show you attempts at trying to stop some persecution, all right? And you hear about that today on the TV, and you read about it in the paper, okay? You see it on your computers. So this racial prejudice that started way back when the colonists came, still prevalent, still has a lot of racial prejudice in the United States, okay? Let's see what else I have for you. So those are ways that we see racial prejudice as today. I want to talk a little bit about several groups. The first group that I'm going to talk about is African Americans. And I touched on the fact that when African Americans came to the country, they came to be slaves. That was the specific point of what they came for. And white people would talk about white superiority and Black inferiority, okay? And they would use the intimidation with different things, and also with the KKK. And all of those things started to pile up. I mentioned Rosa Parks, who would not give up her seat on the bus, making a statement, "I'm tired, my feet hurt, I'm sitting in this seat," right? That wasn't great. They didn't like that. That went against the white supremacy, the white rules that were in place. Dr. Martin Luther King started the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was done through being peaceful and trying to talk about things as opposed to fighting about them, and to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And that was done. One of the things that we see when there's persecution against various groups, right now I'm just talking about African Americans, is bombings or shootings at religious institutions. That's another way that people will target other groups. And there have been bombings and burnings of African American churches. And I'll stop right there. I'm not saying it hasn't happened with others. I will get to those later. And in 2015, 9 Black churchgoers, including their pastor, were gunned down by a white supremacist. 145 fires were set to churches in the South in the 1990s. Intimidation, persecution. I'm going to show you a video about some persecution and some things with African Americans. Again, bear with me. I'll try to share this with you. Come on. Uh-oh. I'm not getting a lot of things here. Hold on. Jake? Hold on. My helper's coming. Jake, I can't share screen. Oh, I got it now. It wouldn't work. I got it.
Share sound. Click share sound. And then you double click this screen.
Okay, I just do this one.
Yeah, this one. Then yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, here we go. So take a look at some of the signs you see.
The dividing line, the racial dividing line of Birmingham, Alabama. We are passing the home of Arthur Shores, whose home was bombed 3 different times during the 60s.
Jeff Drew cannot forget what life was like living in the segregated South of the 1960s.
And I was laying on the floor watching the TV, and the next moment, me and the TV are at the ceiling. It had literally blown us both off the floor. And I had my first taste of what a dynamite blast felt like.
Drew's family wasn't welcome in an all-white neighborhood. Determined to stay, his father took action to protect his family from hate groups.
That wall was built to stop the bullets and the dynamite that the Klan would shoot and throw.
Frankie Adams Johnson grew up in Mississippi, surrounded by symbols of racial segregation.
Whites were privileged, blacks were there unprivileged, and we lived with signs of symbols of segregation. Whites here, blacks here.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
50 years ago, Birmingham was known as the most segregated city in the South. An example was here at the Lyric Theater. White customers could go through this entrance, while black customers had to go around the corner to a back alley entrance that was marked colored only.
Many Southern communities passed laws to separate blacks and whites in schools, restaurants,
Segregation.
and many other public
Separating.
places. Congressman John Lewis, who grew up in rural Alabama, says he tasted the bitter fruits of racism.
I didn't like it. I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, white waiting, colored waiting.
Mississippi is a state that has consistently resisted any move to rid itself of racism.
Hollis Watkins from Mississippi remembers some of the unwritten rules.
If you were walking down the sidewalk and you meet white people, you step off the side and bow your head until they pass. Because if you didn't, it could be considered disrespectful, and they might kick you, beat you, or put you in jail.
I'm not for integration, I'm for segregation, and I will be until I die.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In June 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked 2 African Americans from enrolling at the all-white University of Alabama. After federal marshals and the National Guard stepped in, Wallace stepped aside. For his daughter Peggy, it was a painful memory.
It stained Alabama, of course, but it stained him for the rest of his life.
We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind.
The symbols of racial segregation in the South started disappearing after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
President Johnson affixes his signature,
giving millions of African Americans the same freedoms and liberties enjoyed by the country's then predominantly white population. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay. I would love to do this, but I don't understand why this computer's not working well today. Hold on, Jake, it won't do it again. I can't stop share.
What's wrong?
I don't know. Okay, so we're back. I don't know what's going on with the computer today, but all right, Jake is here to help me. So look, you saw persecution. You saw segregation, separating whites and blacks. You saw persecution. You saw people hosing protests with powerful hoses, okay? Discrimination in all its forms, okay? When President Barack Obama was elected as the first Black American, African American president, people thought that it finally started to break down some of the stereotypes and the persecution towards African Americans. But, and I'm not saying he was wrong or right, I'm just bringing a point of view up, okay? My job is only to inform, not to lecture you on who is right and who is wrong. But during the Donald Trump years as president, he was very prejudiced, and he seemed to have affiliations, connections with white supremacist groups, okay? And so that showed that maybe they hadn't gotten quite as far as they thought as far as civil rights for African Americans. But there are always good people. The United States and all other countries are filled with good people. And those are the ones that will strive to make things better. We see on TV protests called Black Lives Matter. There was a move that was started in 2013 when a man killed an African-American man, a teenager, Trayvon Martin, and he was shot in the back. We saw the trial and the video of George Floyd, a Black man who was killed on the street when an officer held him down with his knee on his neck for over 9 seconds, causing difficulty with breathing, and he died. The part that comes through, okay, is we are talking about police officers, but in this case, and I think that police officers are wonderful, okay, and they risk their lives for us every day. But what happened was it brought these cases into the sight of people because the victims were always African American. The people who were doing the perpetration or harm or white. And that made a lot of questions be asked. Why were these things happening? So we see a variety of changes that have come through with the civil rights movement and whatever. The civil rights movement, voting reform, it's against the law to steer people away from certain areas when they want to buy a house. You can file a claim if you feel that you were discriminated because of race when you're applying for a job. What did we just see recently in the news about that? I don't remember his name. I'm sorry, I'm not a football fan, but he was a coach and he applied for a job and he knew that they already had hired a white coach for the position. And he is claiming, and you can watch this on the news, he is claiming the only reason why he was interviewed was they had to show that they were interviewing people of different races. So these are things that happened in the past. These are things that happen in the present. I want to talk a little bit now about Native Americans. Native Americans were the first inhabitants of North America, and white settlers waged war against them. And I talked a little bit about that when we started. They waged war with them because they felt that they were savages, okay? Do you remember we talked about, we did the art class, the visual arts class, and we studied Mount Rushmore, and it was these 4 white presidents in this beautiful sculpted piece on a rocky mountain outpouring, and they look out on the lands where Native Americans were actually massacred there. So it's pretty ironic, isn't it? Native Americans were forced, after fighting and trying to wipe them out, were forced to assimilate into society. What does assimilate mean? It means forcing people to forget about their native or their cultures, okay? And they were also sent to live on reservations away from their original land. And many times in the past, Native American children were taken away from their families to go to the Indian school where they would learn to assimilate. These schools were horribly run, okay? They were in the United States and they were in Canada as well. And we'll see a little bit about that in a few minutes. The Removal Act of 1830 was based on the belief that Native Americans were merciless and they were savages. And that act caused like a dehumanization of Native Americans, treating them as if they really weren't human. They weren't people who were deserving of rights and respect. During the gold rush in California, Native Americans were enslaved by white people to pan and dig and mine for gold. And we also saw that internment camps, and that word's going to come up again in this lecture. Internment camps, places that were like prisoner of war camps, usually for people who are considered a threat during a war, are kept. They're like jails. The situation is, there's no camp about it. But in 1864, over 9,000 Navajo Indians were put into internment camps. When the camps were dissolved, when they were taken down, over 3,500, okay, women and children had died from starvation and disease. So that was a little more than a third had died. There were conflicts all along with Native Americans. And there was one very well-known battle called the Battle of Wounded Knee. And that's when the United States decided to seize the land of the Lakota Indians. And in order to do that, 300 Indians or Native Americans were slaughtered in that one battle because they wanted the white settlers wanted that land. There were bitter marches of taking Native Americans off their land and marching them for hundreds and hundreds of miles to place them someplace else with very little food, through the cold, through the rain. As people began to move out west, it was really believed that the white settlers should exterminate all Native Americans, so it'd be safe for them to live. What they did is they set up reservations where they were moved and they had to live there. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And I talked about the residential schools. These schools were found in the United States and in Canada, and these children were taken forcibly by the government and placed in these schools where they lived, where they were many times beaten, abused, had their hair cut, were not allowed to talk in their native language, could not dress in native clothing. They were trying to exterminate or remove all of that and make them what the white settlers or white people wanted. Now, I'll try this again. I have a great video. Let's see if it works. Ah, look at that. Okay. Let's see if it's coming on. No. Hold on. All right, this is about Indian schools.
Your work can feel much smoother with Monday.com WorkOS.
The Native American boarding school era is a dark chapter of American history. The policy was known as assimilation. Everything native was to be stripped away. The thought was to kill the Indian and save the man. Their language was to be unspoken.
All of these children were taken from their homes. They're all dressed alike. Their hair is all cut.
This program is made possible in part by the Lawrence TD Janet.
We'll
TD
only look at a
Foundation.
part of this video. It's a long one.
If the Great Spirit had desired me to be a white man, he would have made me so in the first place. Sitting Bull. Stories are told of Native children doing everything they could to escape boarding schools. Home was far away. They longed for anything familiar. Many were unsure as to what had happened to them. They came from another world. Children took pride in their long hair. It was a symbol of strength and dignity. Their hair was cut to Anglo standards. Native clothes changed to military-style uniforms. They were forbidden to practice their way of life in the early boarding school years. Previously, relationships had been based upon the natural world and each other. Prayer and ceremony were important aspects of life. The early schools were run with military precision.
It was more accurately should be called ethnic cleansing rather than assimilation, and it has had devastating effects on white people.
I think that was a time when the government really felt like that was their last option, you know, with the so-called Indian problem that they had to deal with, and it was the last option to go for the children.
This photo from the Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation shows families camped near a boarding school in South Dakota. close family proximity was discouraged.
Assimilation affected the Utes in a very tragic way. It was so ineffective that it did not train us to become competent in the white world, and it took us away from our own culture, so much so that we weren't even competent as Indians anymore.
On Utah's San Juan River. Cliffs and alcoves along the river offer glimpses of past civilizations. Beginning thousands of years ago, ancestral Puebloans were some of the first inhabitants of this area. The dwellings of River House provided sweeping vistas for ancient people who lived here. Petroglyphs etched into stone tell stories of ancient times. Ancestral Pueblo families lived here seeking survival.
Jake.
European explorers arrived in the Americas.
I can't stop this.
They entered a world
and I can't
inhabited by
stop sharing.
indigenous
There's something wrong with the mouse.
Must be.
1 second. Yeah, it is stuck.
All right, and stop share.
Mhm.
Okay, sorry guys, it's just this mouse is really giving me a hard time. So you saw what happened to these poor children. Everything that they knew was taken away from them. Native Americans are still one of the most economically depressed cultures in the United States. There's huge alcoholism, huge problems from smoking, and a lot of depression and suicide. I'm going to talk a little bit about Asian Americans next. And again, the Nationalization Act of 1790 made Asian Americans unable to become citizens. You see a lot of discrimination against Asians throughout the history of the United States. When they were first building the Transcontinental Railroad, which means the first railroad that went from the East Coast to the West Coast. They didn't have trains that went all the way across the country at that time. It was a very hard job, a very long job. What happened was they used Chinese immigrant labor to fill in, to help build the railroad. These immigrants were treated very poorly, given very little or no wages, fed just basically to keep them alive. A lot of the Chinese, the immigrants, were in California because they started from the East Coast and the West Coast. And because China's closer to the West Coast, there were many more Chinese there. And they really did work very, very hard and were very much discriminated against. In 1879, California prohibited the employment for state and local jobs and for the Chinese. And the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act said that Chinese laborers could not work in California for 10 years. Remember, I talked to you about jobs and discrimination with that. If you can't work, how do you make money to buy food or get a place to live? And then in 1892, acts were passed requiring that all Chinese citizens carry their permits with them, and they could be stopped at any time and asked to produce it. And if they did not have that, they could go to jail. There were also very many massacres of Chinese where mobs attacked them. They believed that they were taking their jobs away. They were a threat. There's a lot of persecution for Chinese. Japanese immigrants were discriminated against during World War II. Many were citizens of the United States, but we were in a war with Japan. How could you tell if the Japanese person was a good Japanese person or a bad Japanese person? They reasoned. How do we know if they're not spies? They said. Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and we entered into World War II. How can we settle this? They think. And President Roosevelt decides that he's going to stop Japanese immigration. And Asian immigration from all countries was stopped as well in 1917. So there were lots of different things that went along. But in World War II, they decided that better round up all those Asians, especially Japanese, and put them in an internment camp. We heard that before too, right? Internment camp is a prison for people who are thought to be a threat, especially during times of war. Many of these Japanese people had lived in the United States for a long time. Many Japanese Americans fought in World War II. But when this happened, their homes were taken away, their businesses were taken away, families were separated and put into internment camps where there was very little clean water. Many of the places that they were settled in were muddy all the time. There was less food than what they needed. It was a horrible time. That racism grew because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Okay, that's when the United States went into World War II. And then later on, we see more racism and discrimination against Asians when we fight in the Korean War and we fight in Vietnam. Some people will say everybody's the same. Everyone's the same. They're Asians, they're all the same. Well, of course, educated people know that's not true. But when there's fear during a time of war, people many times act irrationally. And we've seen that during the pandemic with attacks against Asians, blaming all Asians, saying that they were the ones that caused the pandemic. So recently, hate crimes against Asian Americans has increased 73% in 2020. And Asian elders are attacked, young people are attacked. They're just attacking anyone that they want. A young woman just recently was pushed onto the train tracks in the subway and was killed. We see many grandparents who are in their 70s or 80s who go out or are afraid to go out, who have been hit and kicked and knocked down on the street. So we're seeing the continuation of discrimination against Asians even today. The next group I'd like to talk to about is Hispanics. Hispanics make up a lot of different groups. I mean, I've mentioned a little bit about what's happening with the border in Mexico. Ex-President Trump wanted to build a wall. Get this big wall up over there and we can keep all these people out. We don't want them. They're drug dealers. They're going to steal our jobs. They're crooks and many other horrible things. That's what he said. But what we see many times is people fleeing from Mexico or Latin America or South America, going through a terrible time, giving all of their belongings away to pay coyotes, people who will take them to the border in a hope to get a better life. Hispanics have been discriminated against in school systems. They were told at times that they couldn't serve as a juror in the courts. Remember, that's really a big threat because you have no voice, right? Other people could try you, for crime, but you can't be in a jury to see about others. Mexicans were treated terribly. In 1929 and 1935, 82,000 Mexicans were deported from the country. Deported, sent back to their country, never to be allowed back in for at least 10 years. We see that Hispanics are the largest growing population in the United States. All right. And this is causing concern from white supremacists. The same white supremacists that intimidated, that beat, that hung African Americans, the same ones that talk about Asians today bringing COVID to the United States. Now, that is not to say that all white people are bad. Of course they're not. White supremacists, people who only think of themselves and their race as the top, are the ones that we're talking about. You know, and 30% of Hispanic students have graduated from high school in the United States, and less than 4% have entered college. Now, things are changing now. There are ways where grants and scholarships are given to people who are having a hard time with paying for things. There are different organizations out there that will help Hispanics to get into jobs and to get into school. So we're starting to look at that. I'm going to try very hard, because I know this mouse is really a pain in the neck, but I'm going to try to share a video about civil rights and Hispanics for you, okay? Hold on. Jake. No share.
No share.
See, I do it like 5 times. And
Maybe you need to click like with some power.
I did. But hold on, let's just see if we can get this to work. All right. All right, let's see. I got it. I'll call you if I need you. Thank you so much. This video is about Hispanics in Texas.
As African Americans fought for civil rights throughout the 20th century, Hispanic Americans were engaged in a parallel struggle, even if it wasn't in the national headlines. Despite the fact that its first non-native residents spoke Spanish, Texas's story for many years had been told from a primarily Anglo point of view, which often cast the Tejano as an outsider. As a result, Tejano citizens in the early 20th century met prejudice in many aspects of their lives. Anti-Mexican hatred sometimes led to violence, beatings and lynchings, as well as more commonplace discrimination in the workplace
Read this
and community.
sign.
Up until the 60s, it was not unusual to find a sign on stores or restaurants that read, "No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans." Tejanos were subject to the same Jim Crow laws and city ordinances
Poll
used
tax.
to restrict African Americans, disenfranchising Tejanos, segregating them, and depriving them of opportunity. In the 1920s, Tejanos reacted by forming organizations to protect their rights. Mutual aid societies, or sociedades mutualistas. One organization called Orden Hijos de América, or Order of Sons of America, formed branches throughout Texas and, using the U.S. Constitution as their hammer, cracked open access to schools, beaches, public facilities, and participation on juries. Over time, the Order of Sons merged with other Hispanic rights organizations, creating the League of United Latin American Citizens in 1929. dedicated to advancing education, economic power, political influence, housing, health, and civil rights for all Hispanics. This instrument for advocacy was eventually complemented by other civil rights organizations. In the 1960s, the farm workers' movement provided another powerful catalyst for awakening the country to inequality and unfair labor practices, an effort that achieved nationwide attention, affecting all Americans whenever they sat down to supper. As they worked tirelessly for civil rights, Mexican Americans also sought the next level of empowerment, ethnic pride. The Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, reinforced this effort, encouraging Hispanics to continuing activism and cultural expression.
So you saw some other things that were kind of ironic, right? In Texas, most of the people had come from Mexico. Or if they were living here, they spoke Spanish anyway because people went back and forth across the border. But then they were being discriminated against. We saw the part about Cesar Chavez. He really fought for the farm workers. The farm workers worked long days, back-breaking labor in the hot sun, picking vegetables or fruits for our tables with very low wages and long hours. And during that time, they were beginning to be able to change some of that, right, to make the conditions better. The last group, I'm sorry, that I'd like to touch on is about Jewish Americans. They too have been persecuted, as I mentioned earlier, by the KKK, with temples and synagogues burned, with people lynched. They were blamed. People in the United States blamed the Jews for dragging the United States into World War II because Jews were being exterminated by Hitler. Anti-Semitic is an attack on Jews, anti-Semitic attacks on synagogues, with racial slurs, racial words, hate words were put on synagogues, much like when we talked about Black churches being targeted and burned. 2018, a man named Robert Bowers opened fire on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, killing 11 people. This hostility towards Jews has existed even when we talked about being in Jerusalem and how the Romans were moving in and there was huge battles. It moved on to other times. During World War II, we saw Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jews. There were a lot of different things. One of the things that I find for racial prejudice is people being ignorant or unaware about differences between different people. Every one of us is different, okay? Every one of us is different. We worship one way. We look one way. Some of us speak different languages. We've lived in different countries. So it's important for us to understand and learn about the culture of all the people in the world. That in turn will stop some of the racial prejudice that exists. Unfortunately, it will not stop all. I should be able to give you one more video. It's very short. It's about anti-Semitism, and then we will be finished with this session. Let's see if I can get this to work. Ah, look at that. Wait a minute. I am not singing that, but let me show you something before that. Maybe I can find it. This is about life of Japanese Americans in internment camps.
My name is Yoji Matsushima. I was born in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Old Town, or Nihonmachi, on 3rd and Davis Street. That was my home. My father was born in Okayama, Japan, 1899. And my mother was born in 1909. It was arranged marriage.
His father was a prominent businessman prior to World War II. After Pearl Harbor, he was picked up by the
father
FBI.
And my uncle both got arrested on December the 11th. The money from the store was all confiscated. They couldn't touch the money. He ended up at Rocky View Jail for about 2 weeks. Then he was transferred to Missoula, Montana toward the end of December.
So Missoula, Montana was one of some of the special internment camps. And then he was also transferred to another one.
In Santa Fe, New Mexico. And that picture showed the group from Portland. I believe there was about 78 that were in that picture. They were considered POWs.
Prisoners
enemy
of war.
aliens.
The rest of his family was sent to Minnesota.
We were separated for over 2 years, almost 2 years. My mother and dad, through the Red Cross, communicated, and they decided that they were going to repatriate to Japan during the war. I had a brother and a sister in Japan, and they wanted the family together, and they thought that it might be better if we were together. You have diplomats, people, families that were stuck in Japan or maybe in somewhere else like Philippines, and they wanted to repatriate, come back. They would exchange one prisoner for one for one. There was a Swedish ship called Gripzone. We went from Minnedoka to New Jersey, and we were by the dock side of the ship, and we didn't see my dad. He never came out.
Their names have been left off the list, so they couldn't sail to Japan as they wanted to. So they went on to a train to another internment camp.
We go to a place called Crystal City, Texas, which is about 40 miles
Look at
from
that
the
guard
border
tower.
of Mexico. And we didn't even know that there was a camp like that. It was a family internment camp. But we had German families and Italian families and Japanese families and people from Peru and South America. Very interesting group. The Germans were segregated from the Japanese, not by wire, it was just different area. One thing is we were under the Geneva Convention rules, and the best thing about that was that instead of barracks, we were in cabins. Each family had a kitchen of their own. It wasn't much of a kitchen, but we had a kerosene stove, and we had icebox, real icebox that they would deliver ice to every day. And they would deliver milk every day. And my mother would go down to the grocery store and buy groceries every day and use special camp money made out of plastic.
And about 6 months later,
April the 3rd, 1946.
they were
I
released.
remember that day. I remember Mrs. Horigami on the bus going to the city of Uvalde, Texas to catch her train. She was just jumping up and down like, I didn't think that Issei ladies were.
So you saw what those internment camps were like. So we saw a taste of racial persecution throughout the United States, throughout many times, different generations. There was a comparison with some of the things that happened in the past, that happened now. So we as people need to keep in mind about these things so that they do not happen again. I thank you for listening to this lecture. I know it was a long one for you, and I know that some of you can relate to some of the things that we've discussed today. Your teacher will be back with a lecture next week, but remember, your class is not going to do a review for the midterm next week. We're going to let this go a little bit slower so you can catch up on all of your videos. Well, have a wonderful week. It was a pleasure being here with you, and I will see you in my history class soon. Bye.